Okay, so these are our most common pay periods that we use. And most of you are familiar with these different types of pay periods. Maybe you've had various jobs where one job you were paid on a weekly basis, one job you were paid on a bi-weekly basis every 2 weeks, maybe you were paid once a month, that sort of thing. So these are the most common. There are employers that would pay like on a quarterly basis. I can't imagine that. I mean, that's not very common for that to happen. Employees tend to like to be paid more frequently rather than less frequently. What they've got listed up here, what's in parentheses, is the number of pays per year that an employee would have based on their pay frequency. So if there are 52 weeks in a year, if somebody's paid on a weekly basis, they would be paid 52 times a year. Now, it doesn't matter what day of the week they're paid on. They can be paid on Friday. That's a very common day to be paid. They can be paid on Wednesday, Tuesday. It doesn't really matter as long as it's consistent, as long as the employer is consistent with when they're paying employees. It doesn't really matter. They can pay on any cycle they want, and they can pay on any day that they want for the weekly and biweekly. Now, biweekly is 26 days. It's very easy, by the way, to confuse biweekly and semi-monthly. That bi and semi, they both kind of mean two. Biweekly is every 2 weeks. So because it's every 2 weeks, and there are 52 weeks in a year, you get 26 pays in a year if you're on a bi-weekly pay cycle. So again, even if you're on bi-weekly, it might be any day of the week. Very common way of paying employees is every other Friday. That would be a bi-weekly pay schedule. Semi-monthly is twice per month. Now, again, the employer can choose whichever days they want to pay. Actually, it's the dates. So in this case, with weekly and bi-weekly, it was always going to fall on the same day of the week, every Friday or every other Friday. If you're paid on a semi-monthly or a monthly schedule, that payday the actual day of the week is going to vary every pay period. For a semi-monthly, you might commonly, employers will pay like the 15th and the 31st, or the 15th and the last day of the month. So might be the 31st, might be the 30th, might be the 28th, depending upon what month it is, right? But the day of the week is going to change every pay period. One pay period's a Wednesday, one pay period's a Friday, and then the next pay period's a Tuesday, because it's based on the date, not the day of the week. You look like you had a question.
Yes. These rules only apply for employees like exempt.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. These apply to all employees. So, and the employer can choose what schedule they're on. Okay?
Even if the employer is the independent contractor?
Well, if an employer is an independent, yes. So if an employer is an independent contractor and they have employees, in that case, yes. They can choose what their pay schedule is going to be. Okay?
It has to be one of those.
Generally speaking, these are the most common, right? These are the ones that we're going to use in our calculations. But I want you to become familiar with this terminology of the weekly, bi-weekly, semi-monthly, monthly, and become familiar with how many pay periods there are in a year. Because if you're going to have problems that state, Maria Maria works for XYZ company. She has a salary of $40,000 a year. She's paid on a bi-weekly basis. How much is she paid every pay period? That sort of thing. So you have to know, okay, well, what am I going to divide that annual salary by? And then on top of that, she is a non-exempt employee, so she's entitled to overtime, and she worked 2 hours of overtime this pay period. What's her overtime rate based on that information? So that's why becoming familiar with this terminology is important. So semi-monthly, like I said, be careful with the biweekly and semi-monthly. Biweekly, again, is every 2 weeks. Semi-monthly is twice a month. So with biweekly, we'd have 26 pays in a year. With semi-monthly, we'd have 24. If it's twice a month, 12 months, obviously, there would be then 24 pays during the year. Now, this one, what I was talking about before, is with weekly and biweekly, it's always going to be on the same day of the week. So either every Friday or every other Friday, if the pay is on a Friday, right? Every Saturday or every other Saturday. It's always going to be the same day of the week. But the date is going to be different. Like sometimes it'll be on the 8th of the month, and sometimes it'll be on the 16th of the month, and that will vary. With semi-monthly and monthly pay cycles, that means that the date is going to stay the same. So the 15th and the last day of the month. I guess the last day of the month wouldn't exactly be the same, but you know what I'm talking about. So let's call it the first day of the month then. It will always be the 1st and the 15th. But the day of the week is going to change every time with semi-monthly and with monthly. Now, employers can also have different pay periods for different groups within a company. It's really common for, let's think of a construction company. Really common for construction companies to pay their workers, the workers that are actually working in construction, on a weekly basis. So they'll pay them every week. But then the executives or the office staff maybe get paid on a monthly basis. So different pay cycles that you have to keep track of. So the payroll department has to then keep track of what the payroll cycle is. It gets more complicated, obviously, when you do that. Because in addition to the pay cycle changing and the pay date changing, the dates that you have to pay the IRS and the different agencies also would be different for those different pay cycles. Okay, but it is possible to have different pay periods for different groups of people within the same company. So they don't have to just have one, and the employer gets to choose. They get to choose what the pay cycle is. There's nothing that says they have to pay on a weekly basis or a semi-monthly basis. Usually it's based on like industry standard. Like I said, construction, for the construction workers, usually it's very common every week, every Friday to get paid. But it's also very common for executives and professionals to get paid on a monthly basis. That's how I got paid when I was a CPA, working in a CPA firm. DMAC pays semi-monthly, twice a month. So those are our main pay periods, pay cycles that we're going to be working with. Like I said, there are others too, but they're not nearly as common. These are the main ones. Other questions on these? All right. Okay. Let's start talking about what we got here. 12:05. All right. Okay, so how do we calculate overtime? Let me erase this. I'm gonna need some space. So remember, our work week, our overtime week, is actually, I want to go back to this slide because I want to talk about this. I forgot to mention this. So when it comes to overtime and calculating overtime, you recall that our overtime week was 168 consecutive hours of time, right? So it may start Sunday morning at midnight and end Saturday night at 11:59 p.m. That's 168 full hours. That would be within that period. That's when we calculate whether somebody has worked for over 40 hours during a week. So, for example, what that would look like. So, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So, if we use this as we start at 12 a.m. and we go through Saturday night at 11:59 p.m. We're going to use these dates as our cutoff to calculate whether or not overtime has been earned during that time. So if you've got an employee, they don't work on weekends. Let's say they don't work on weekends. They worked 8 hours on Monday, 8 hours on Tuesday, 7 hours on Wednesday, 11 hours on Thursday, and 10 hours on Friday. These are the hours that we're going to calculate to determine if over 40 hours have been worked during that time. So what do we have here? I don't know, somebody can do the math for me. 21, 28, 38 plus 6 is 44. Does that look about right? Yes. Okay. So in this case, they have worked 4 hours of overtime during this pay period. Now, if we looked at the next week, so here's week 1, and during week 2, they worked 8, 8, 8, 8, 8. They worked 40 hours. They did not work any overtime during that pay period, during that week, right? Let's say they worked, so week 3, they worked 12, 12, 12, 4, and then they took Friday off. They still worked 40 hours, right? So, but the important thing is we're measuring those 40 hours starting at midnight on Sunday, ending at 11:59 p.m. on Saturday. We're only measuring. So we're not going to take the 11, 10, 8, 8, 8, right? It doesn't matter that they worked overtime, like what, 5 hours of overtime from Thursday to Wednesday. It doesn't matter. What we're concerned about is what did they work from Saturday to Sunday, Sunday to Saturday. Okay, so that is our overtime week. This is what we're going to use in order to calculate. Now, I want you to think about, for a weekly pay schedule, that's pretty easy to calculate, right? Especially, you always want your overtime week to match your pay schedule week. Like, it would make life really difficult if your overtime week was Thursday morning to Wednesday night, but your pay was calculated from Sunday to Saturday. It would make it really difficult for purposes of calculating overtime, right? That would make it difficult. So you really do want your overtime week to match your pay schedule. However, for weekly and biweekly, that's pretty easy because we've got our overtime weeks up here, and it's also our pay schedule. That's easy to calculate for 4 hours of overtime here. For biweekly, it would be super easy too. We're just going to look at each week separately, but then add them together. So if it was a biweekly schedule, this individual's worked, and it ended here, they worked 80 hours of regular time and 4 hours of overtime. And that's super easy to calculate. It gets a little bit more complicated when you have a semi-monthly or a monthly schedule, because remember, those days when the pay schedule now doesn't align with the overtime week schedule. So you've got to keep track. Now let's say we had with this individual, I'm trying to see what's a good cutoff. Let's say this last week, they actually worked 2 hours of overtime. So for the week, they worked 42 hours. They would be entitled to 2 hours of overtime. But if they're on a semi-monthly pay schedule, and it ends on the Tuesday, meaning we're going to calculate for our purposes, so 1, 2, 3 is, I don't know what date that would be. We'll just leave it at that. So the pay schedule ends on Tuesday. At this point, like, we're going to calculate up to this date to determine what they're going to be paid for that pay date. But during this week, they worked overtime, but at this point, they didn't work overtime. So they're not going to be paid those 2 hours of overtime on this paycheck. That's going to have to come on the next paycheck because they don't actually work it until the next paycheck. So we've got a timing difference between our overtime week and our pay schedule week. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. So when you're preparing then the next pay, you've got to take into account that those 2 hours were overtime hours, even though it's right at the beginning of the pay period, right? But as the payroll professional, you've got to keep track of the fact that, okay, yeah, they've only worked for the pay period, they've only worked 18 hours on this Friday, but this 2 of these hours was overtime because they worked over 40 hours during that full week. Okay, I just say that. I know it sounds complicated. I'm getting a lot of glazed looks right now, or like looks of fear. But I just mentioned that right now as something to anticipate that that's a complication, down the road. That happens with the semi-monthly pay schedule, and it happens with the monthly pay schedule. And that's simply because the day of the week, the payday, changes. It's not always going to be Monday or Friday. Sometimes it's going to be Monday, sometimes it's going to be Tuesday, sometimes it's going to be Wednesday. What changes is what doesn't change is the date that it's paid. So like monthly, every 15th, you're going to get paid. That's what doesn't change, but the day of the week does change. Okay?